I want to warmly welcome you as the moderator tonight to our author book talk with the title of Chinese Husbands, Western Wives, featuring two memoirs, Rabbit in the Moon by a newly published book by Heather Diamond, and Good Chinese Wife by Susan Blumberg-Kason. So some of you are in Hong Kong and some of you are in the US. Some of you perhaps are in other places as well, but I wanted to start with a warm thanks to our sponsor this evening, which is Bleak House Books, and particularly to Albert Wan, who is co-founder and chief bookworm #1 of Bleak House Books. It's for those of you who are not in Hong Kong and perhaps don't know about it, it's a cozy little indie bookshop in San Po Kong in Kowloon section of Hong Kong. And all three of us really love supporting indie bookstores. So we're delighted to have Bleak House Books with us tonight. And we encourage all of those who are living in Hong Kong to go to Bleak House Books. They have copies of Heather's book. So Heather actually went to the Bleak House Books and filmed this so that you would get a personal sense of just how cozy this bookstore is. And those of you who are interested in Susan's book, or you'll find out a little bit later about my book as well, we want to let you know that you can ask them at Bleak House Books to special order it for you. Or you can, of course, in the United States, all three of our books are sold wherever books are sold, whether you want to buy it online or through an independent bookstore, wherever you're from. We love supporting independent bookstores. So I'm Dori Jones Yang, and I just wanted to start today by introducing our speakers. So the first one, well, before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of background about how we're going to do this today. So I'll be the moderator. Susan and Heather are our speakers, and I will start out by giving you just a little bit of background about each of them and about their books, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. After we've had a little bit of an interview, I'll be interviewing each of them with some questions of my own in the first, say, half an hour or so. But the whole time, anytime during that, we really encourage you to type questions into the chat. We love interaction with audiences. And that's the whole thing about writing a book, is you want to be able to interact with your audience. So anytime you have a question, even now, you can type it into the chat, or anytime as people are talking about their book and you have a question that comes from that, we just really encourage you to type it into the chat. And then after I finish my interview with them, we will open it up to questions, and I'll read those questions aloud and say who they're from if you'd like. And I will try to get to as many questions as I possibly can. I don't know, we're going to keep it to an hour, so as many questions as we can get into the time. And I also just wanted to let everyone know, as a matter of courtesy, that we are recording the event tonight, and the authors are going to make the recording available within a few days to anyone who wasn't able to attend. But I wanted those who are attending to just be aware of that. So now for the introductions. Heather Diamond currently lives in Hong Kong, as many of you know, near the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And she's originally from the Seattle area, which is where I'm coming to you from. So I'm coming to you from Seattle. Heather's coming to you from Hong Kong, and Susan is in Chicago area. So this is definitely an East-West, Trans-Pacific, international event today. And that just makes us all very happy. So she, one time, a number of years ago, was taking a summer course about China in Hawaii, and she met Fred Lau, an ethnomusicologist from Hong Kong. And they ended up being attracted to each other and then eventually getting married. So she now has a Chinese husband, and it comes from a very large and boisterous family. These are Heather's words, not mine. And she describes herself as an independent, reserved American. So you can hear a little bit of conflict right there. So there are lots of great, great stories in her book. Fortunately, she had training as a cultural anthropologist and can kind of explain some of the things that she was seeing. And she also has a great sense of humor. So once again, her brand new memoir is called Rabbit in the Moon. It was published just last month by Camper Press. Thank you, Heather. So now I'd like to introduce Susan Blumberg-Kason. She is a freelance journalist in the Chicago area, and she's written many, many book reviews for different Hong Kong publications. So some of you may have seen her byline. So when she was in her 20s, she was born and raised in Chicago and lives there now. But when she was in her 20s, she came to Hong Kong and she studied political science. She got a master's degree there at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. And there she met and married a very handsome man from Wuhan. At least that's what she says. I haven't seen pictures of him yet. And her memoir is called, as I said, Good Chinese Wife. And the subtitle is A Love Affair with China Gone Wrong. So that subtitle gives you a big hint, but there is a lot more to her story. So our presentation focuses on these two authors and their books, and not mine. But full disclosure, I have a personal interest in the topic of Chinese husbands and American wives. As you can see from my name, Dori Jones Yang. I too have a Chinese husband, Paul Yang. And actually, I also lived in Hong Kong, similar to both of our speakers. I lived there during the 1980s. I was a reporter for Business Week covering China. And my memoir came out last September, and it's called When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. And because I had all that experience as a reporter, I'm asking some really tough questions. Is that all right with you guys? It better be. Anyway, so the first question, tough question number one, goes to Heather. So I know that the two of you are friends, and you're friends of mine as well. So I want to know how you met.
That's a good story. Actually, I came across Susan's book while I was writing my book proposal to start looking for a publisher. And I was looking up intercultural memoirs, and I found her book and ordered it, and I started reading it, and immediately was struck by the fact that it was set at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and we were getting ready to move there. It's also my husband's alma mater. And then the more I read, it was also set in the very same department where my husband had been hired as a full professor, where he graduated as an undergrad in flute. And so I showed the book to him, and he started reading it, and he said, I know all these people, even the ones whose names had been changed. He figured out who they were because he's a super sleuth. So then I thought, I have to get in touch with her. So I wrote to Susan, and I sort of tested the waters, and I said, that we were going to CUHK, and wasn't that a coincidence? And she said, wouldn't it be wild if our husbands knew each other? And I said, actually, he does know everyone in your book. So we started with that. We already had some big overlaps. And then she came, after we moved to Hong Kong, she came to Hong Kong for a visit. So we actually got to meet in person. So we've been friends since then.
Yeah, can I add something?
Yeah.
So normally when I correspond with other authors, or they correspond with me, and we meet in real life, it's usually over like coffee or tea, lunch, maybe dinner at the most. But I took Heather on this wild goose chase to the China-Hong Kong border, and it was so crazy because we both had appointments later. We were running late. I hadn't been to this particular part of the border since 1990, and it was totally different. I was really overwhelmed. I had my young kids with me. We couldn't find out how to put our ticket through the machine and re-enter. I had a one-way ticket, and I was going to go back to Central, which was like almost 2 hours away. And my kids were like, "Are you lost, Mom?" And it was just, and then we had to wait like a half hour for another train to come. And so it was like totally chaotic. And just like, because we're still friends, it's a big testament to Heather because that was.
No, that's when I found out that you're a lot like me.
That's a great story. I love it. I am asking these questions and I hadn't heard the answers. I'm curious, since you do have somewhat similar but somewhat different stories, where you started from. I mean, did you know about China or Asia when you were growing up, or at what point in your life? You're both American citizens, born and raised in the US. At what point did you come in contact with Hong Kong and with Chinese customs and Chinese language? Susan, first you.
Oh gosh, I mean, I was young. My uncle worked for TWA, which was one of the big airlines that flew all around the world. And so my grandparents, because they were his parents, could fly anywhere that TWA flew for free. And they went to Hong Kong about 7 or 8 times. And the last time they went, I was about 12. And I think it was like September 82. And that was right when Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing and she tripped down the stairs. And so I started hearing about the handover because that's when the talk started. And at the same time, about 1982, my dad started getting students from China. He was a physical chemist at a university in Chicago. And so they would come over and they would speak amongst themselves. And I thought they were speaking Mandarin. So I thought, well, what a great, language to learn, not knowing it was probably like Shanghainese, because most were from Shanghai. So it was always just like kind of part of my life growing up from the age of 12.
And then did you learn Chinese before you went to Hong Kong?
Mm-hmm. So that was another thing that I thought I was doing right. I started learning Mandarin when I was 19 because I was going to do a year abroad in Hong Kong in 1990 to 91. And I thought I could at least read the signs because, they didn't speak Mandarin in Hong Kong, but I didn't know that I was learning simplified, and in Hong Kong, there was no simplified. So I could read a little bit, it was good. And then when I got to Hong Kong at Chinese U, I mostly took Mandarin, and then I was learning traditional there. So I'm all like confused in my head, but I can understand both now. So
what about you, Heather?
Oh, I'm so embarrassing compared to Susan. I grew up in Everett, Washington, and then moved to Arkansas and Texas. I didn't even have an Asian friend until I was in my 30s, and I started teaching at the Houston Community College, where I taught a lot of Asian students. So my familiarity with Asia was nothing up until that point, and then really through my studies in folklore and my literature reading. So I read a lot of Asian American literature, and like everybody, I saw the Joy Luck Club, and I had a lot of Vietnamese students and some Taiwanese. And I had an opportunity to go to Vietnam with a colleague probably 2 years before I met Fred. So that I was going to the East-West Center in Hawaii in the summer to fill in the gaps in my education, because I realized I didn't know how to teach I was teaching multicultural literature, but I really had very little information. So I started doing my Asian studies in my 30s.
Okay, and then did you study Mandarin or Cantonese along the way?
No, and I started studying Mandarin when I went back to grad school in my 40s, which is in my book. So that was my first introduction. And, I think even now maybe that part of my brain is atrophied, but I speak a little Mandarin, a little Cantonese, and I can understand more than I can speak, but I really am handicapped.
Okay. One thing I notice about your two memoirs is that when you met your Chinese husbands, you were very different ages. So I'm curious to know how that affected you. Both read each other's books as well, to see your perspectives on how the stage of life when you married your Chinese husband affected your experience. Heather, do you want to start?
Yeah, much of my book is about midlife reinvention. So age had a huge effect on my experience, I think, because I was in my mid 40s when I met Fred. I was married in my second marriage. I was already a grandmother. I was pretty settled. So it had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was I wasn't naive about love, and I didn't really, I'd already learned the hard lesson about not ever trying to change your partner, not being with somebody that you wanted to transform. And at the same time, I think I was probably more set in my ways than I would like to admit. I had reached a stage of life where I liked my privacy and my own bathroom. And when I was young, I was much more flexible. So I think that there were, it was also much more complicated because I was in a very settled life. And for both Fred and I, we had to extricate ourselves. It was a lot of emotional turmoil, a lot of baggage that came along with that. So along with the joy of being in love and trying to build a new life, we had to disentangle ourselves from our previous lives. And that's a big part of the early section of my book.
Susan?
Yeah, so I was different. I was 24 and I hadn't dated much at all. But there was also another component here. This was 1994, and my former husband is from China. And so at that point, it was still the case, but it changed very soon after that, where if you dated in China, the understanding would be that you would get married. And so that was what I was in a dorm with mostly mainland Chinese. And the other thing was the female friends I had from China were a little bit older than me, maybe like 26, 27. And they were really worried that they weren't going to find someone to marry them. And to me, 26, 27 is really young. But when I was hearing it day after day, I remember riding the elevators and they were worried. And then I started to wonder, well, gosh, do I have to worry about something too? Because these are really bright women. They were one of like maybe 200 students from mainland China at that point. It was just, when I was at the university in 1990, there were very few, maybe 5. So in just this short amount of time, more came, but they had to have been like the top of their class to have that opportunity. So I had this like internal pressure that I started putting on myself. And I think that I was panicked and maybe I rushed into it, quicker than I would have maybe if I wasn't in that environment.
Well, I have some questions about stories. I really want to get you to telling some stories, but I see that there's some great stuff in the chat, and not questions, but I just wanted to share because I did notice some people say, well, they can't unmute or they can't turn their video on, and that's the setting that we have. So I'm sorry about that nobody can unmute at this point because we set it that way for especially for this part. XH Collins says she is so excited to be here. And Fred is saying hello to his friends, Claire and Chris and Adele. And Bicknock Turner said she's joining from the Seattle area as well. And Ivy says, ni hao, I'm joining from Escondido, California. I was adopted from China under the One China policy. So we have a lot of different East-West stories going on in the audience. Someone else says wild. And Ivy said that her American name is Ivy Maldonado, but her Chinese name is Zhuhua, Ni Zhuhua. And she was adopted from an Yiwu orphanage in Zhejiang, China. And she loves the Joy Luck Club. And Bicknock Turner says, A Good Chinese Wife and a Good Shufu was my favorite reading in 2018. And Nijua said she's searching for her birth parents in China. So I just wanted to give you kind of a little bit of background for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the chat of who's on the call today. And I see some names I recognize too, and I'm sure both of you do. So one thing I love about both of these stories, and I think anybody who reads them will have the same reaction, is that there are so many great stories, some painful, some just laugh out loud, some like, oh, how is she going to get herself out of this one? So I wanted to get to those stories because I love stories. So let's start with I want to hear from each of you a story about Chinese in-laws. That's a great topic, right? And just what your experience, how your experience differed from what you expected based on your own upbringing. Can we start with Susan on this one?
Sure. I was worried they wouldn't accept me. I went to this small town in Hubei province to meet them before I got married, and they were so nice and so warm and welcoming. So I knew right away that wasn't going to be a problem. But I think the difference with Chinese in-laws um, and in-laws who aren't used to being so connected as a family is that there's really no barrier sometimes between the spouse and the in-law. So maybe a year or so after I got married, my then husband and I went to this little teeny photo studio in Mongkok, which is a very densely populated area of Hong Kong. And it was kind of a rundown building, but inside it was this beautiful studio, and it was like a movie set. And we got to dress in all sorts of different costumes. I wore a white wedding dress, and I wore a traditional qipao, and these were our wedding photos. And although we had been married for a while, we eloped, so we never had, traditional photos. And I thought, wow, this is like such a great experience. It was really fun. It was a husband and wife that had this. The wife did the makeup, and the husband was a photographer. So we had like an album, and we had separate photos. And we went to China soon after that to see his parents. And the next thing I knew, like half the photos are on their wall. And I thought those photos were for us. And it was like my only tangible thing from our wedding, even though it was like, a year later. And there was no discussion about, what would we have? We were in a dorm room. So it was just something that I wasn't expecting. And I realized later that it was just, the in-laws and the wife, there's no difference when it comes to things like that. So
You're a member of the family, so their wall is your wall, right?
right.
That's great. How about you, Heather? You have some great in-law stories.
Yeah, they kind of go in the same direction. I was used to my parents coming to visit us in Hawaii and being so independent that half the time Fred was saying, where are they? We can never find them because they'd go for long walks and forget about us. And I was never really sure if they were coming to see us or just coming to go to Hawaii. But when Fred's parents came to visit the year that we got married, the first thing that his mother did when she came in our apartment was open all my kitchen cabinets and look inside, look in my refrigerator. She toured through the whole place. And then we would go for drives because I had a list of attractions I thought they would like. Nobody would look out the windows. They're just talking in the back, his sister and his mother, and they're putting on hand lotion. They have no interest in, and I said to Fred, they have no interest in nature or culture. So what are we going to do with them? He said, it doesn't matter. They just came here to see us. All they wanted to do was sit around in our apartment and be with us. And so at the time I didn't realize, it was really all about family, not about, doing things and activities together. So it took me a long time to figure that out. So then when they went on a trip to the Big Island, I opted out because I'd had my fill of together time and they obviously hadn't had enough.
Well, that gets to my next question, which is about family togetherness and privacy, which I think both of you noted are very different in Chinese families than they are in American families. So how did that play out for you? Heather, you first.
The very first trip that I took to Hong Kong, we weren't even married yet. I had asked a Malaysian Chinese friend how to cope with it because I knew I couldn't do communal living. I was already in a dorm and I was older than most of the students were half my age and younger than my daughter. So I already knew communalism wasn't my thing. So she said, take a little trip for a couple days and come back. So I presented this to friends and I researched and I said, we'll go to Macau for a couple of days and we'll come back, then I'll be fine. He said, it won't work. And I got really testy with him and said, you need to try, just let her know we're going, let's do it. So he went and talked to her and he came back looking very sheepish and said, I said, did you tell her? He said, yeah, they're all going. So 16 people went on our trip. instantaneously. They had reservations. We all went to a hotel. We spent the entire 2 days together, except for when we were sleeping at meals and everywhere we went, and came back. And of course I said, next time I'm not going to do this. And the next time we got there, the tickets were already bought and we went on another trip together. So yeah.
Well, they wouldn't want to leave you alone, right? Just the two of you. It would be too lonely, right? That's not romantic.
They actually asked if all the children could sleep in our room, and Fred said no to that.
There are some limits. Wow. What about you, Susan? Did you run into anything like that?
Yeah, I did. And the memorable thing was, it was a Chinese New Year, so it was cold in Hubei province. And we would go stay with my in-laws for 3 weeks or so. And it was fine. I mean, there was no heat. We had our own room. We had electric blankets. So I was okay with that. I was, bundled during the day. But one day we loaded this big truck, and nobody could own cars back then. This was like 1995. So if you were in a Donway or a work unit and you had access to a car, that was the only way to get a car. So a brother-in-law had got access to this huge truck, and we loaded 12 people into it. And we drove out to the countryside to see some relatives that my then husband hadn't seen in decades. And while we were there, I mean, this was like a very basic country house. There was like cement floors. There were 2 chairs in the living room. There was a little makeshift kitchen. And there was a staircase going up, and I assume that's where the bedrooms were. But it was really bare bones. And there was no toilet. So it was outdoor next to the barn. So at some point that afternoon, and we're all like freezing, somebody in our party suggested we sleep over there. And I am not a camper. So it was like, this was not going to work for me. I didn't know how I would get warm. I mean, where are we going to sleep? It was almost like you talk about like inviting people first, and then you figure out like the accommodations. And all the like brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law were getting really excited about it. I looked to my in-laws, my parents-in-law, and they seemed to be okay. But then I noticed my youngest sister-in-law, who was the only one that was younger than me, was pouting. And so I knew that she was going to be an ally. And I went up to her and I said, do you really want to sleep here overnight? And she's like, no. She's like, I don't want to sleep here at all. She's like, she wants her bed. She wants her warmth, even though there was no heat indoors. So I knew that she and I could work something out. And I said, I don't want to do this either. So she used my like foreignness to go to her parents and say, Susan doesn't want to, sleep her overnight. I don't think we should do it. And then we both got our way and we went home that night. And so even though I was in a place with no heat, with my electric blanket and drinking tea all day, that was still much more comfortable than in something I don't even know to this day, like how it would have worked out. And then going to the bathroom outside, I don't know, like it was just like, it was in an unfamiliar place. It was too much. So.
Well, it sounds like this younger woman was an ally. You found an ally who could kind of take your role, and then she found somebody she could blame it on, right?
Right. And it turns out of his 3 sisters, she's the only one that got divorced. So we have that in common too.
Fred just pointed out that he uses my foreignness to his advantage a lot. I often hear discussions where all I can make out is, American, and everybody goes, oh. Okay. So that way we get the room with the room with the bathroom.
Well, that helps. Another thing I love about both your books is just talking about, especially Heather's book has so many festivals. I mean, all that ethnography and anthropology really show up, and just some very, very lively scenes of different festivals. And I think you both have weddings in your traditional Chinese weddings in your in your stories. So I want to hear some stories, as many as possible, about a Chinese holiday or a wedding, or just something that is really very different from what you were used to when you grew up. So maybe, let's see, who wants to start on this? Susan?
Oh, sure. So this isn't really, doesn't really have much to do with my marriage, but when I first arrived in Hong Kong, it was right when the Mid-Autumn Festival was about to start, and the Chinese University is way out in the New Territories, and the closest, well, I don't know if it's like Shatin is close, the Taipo is on the, the other side. I started going to Taipo, which is where Heather and I and Fred went for lunch when I met them before the trip to the border. So I went to Taipo with some of the other Americans, and one of them, her grandmother lived in Central, and so she was very familiar with Hong Kong. And I remember walking through the markets there, and it was like a sea of red. It was all these like red lanterns for the Mid-Autumn Festival. And this friend introduced me to mooncakes. And I remember I bought like a little butterfly lantern. It was cellophane. So as it got warmer, because it was really hot, it was September, it started shrinking. And but it was just like, we don't have a harvest holiday like that in the US. I mean, we have Thanksgiving, but it's not the same. And Halloween isn't the same. So I just love that. And even now I try to get mooncakes for my kids, and we kind of splurge because they're super expensive in Hong Kong, and I'm, in Chicago, and they're really expensive here too, but it's worth it. So I enjoyed that.
I have to say, I love mooncakes, but not all Americans do. And I didn't realize that. And I had my book club over one time recently, all American women. And I thought, whoa, it's October. I'm going to serve them all mooncakes. And I served them all mooncakes, and they were just appalled. They didn't like them at all. And I thought, how can anybody not like mooncakes?
What a waste.
Yeah, really. Well, I guess we got to eat them afterwards because, well, maybe they would take like one bite of each, and they were just like, thank you, Dori, I guess, whatever. So Heather, tell us at least one, maybe more, about some of these great festivals that you witnessed. By the way, she lived on Chengchao for a while, and that's where her husband Fred's family lives. And that is probably the most picturesque, attractive part, just unusual, close to the original Chinese Cantonese culture and traditions. And you got to see a lot of festivals. So tell us about some of those.
I did. I've realized in the years since then what an opportunity I had and what an advantage I had, because not only is Changzhou still very traditional in many ways, Fred's family is more traditional than most. They have a communal house, and they still practice a lot of traditions that families that have dispersed more haven't been able to do, or have stopped practicing. So I was there for almost a year and through a cycle of festivals, which was really amazing and wonderful. And I was able to participate and to observe a lot of those things. The biggest festival on Changzhou, and the one that the island is most famous for, is the annual Bun Festival. And the Bun Festival is primarily an attraction for they make 3 huge towers covered in steamed buns that are blessed by
Baozi, right?
Yeah, they're baoed, and they're stamped with the characters for safety, and they're mounted on these towers, and people climb the towers and collect the buns. So there's a competition. The whole area in front of the temple, which is a sports field, the rest of the time is transformed with bamboo scaffoldings that are turned into an opera stage, an altar to the King of Ghosts, another kind of stage area where the main bun towers are, and smaller bun towers, and also some enclosures for Taoist rituals. And because I was there with Fred, and because we're both ethnographers and trained in cultural anthropology, I have access to a lot of information other people don't always have. Like, we tend to go the day before the festival, not when the giant parade happens, not during a pandemic, but normally there's a parade. And so we go the day before and watch all the Taoist rituals and the opera, and Fred can tell me what a lot of these are about. And so we also spend time walking around the back streets and seeing all the offerings that people are putting out outside their homes, or in the corners of the plazas in various places. And so I think my most memorable experience with that is going to the Bun Festival the year we lived there, and watching the parade with his family, when all the gods go by. They have these palanquins that they carry the deities through, and all the different Chinese associations and martial arts and lion dances go by. And then the Brazilians came. And that was totally unexpected. There were all of these basically pretty naked women wearing feather boas and giant headdresses and really high heels and prancing to samba music in the midst of the parade. And because I was with a local family, I heard what was going on around. I was taking pictures of all the disapproving looks on the balconies. And then afterwards, I also found out that the group had been whisked away to the ferry before they got to the judges' stand. They just told them your ferry's waiting and took them out of the parade. And they also, when we went to the Chinese association that my father-in-law belongs to afterwards, I heard all the conversation about how nasty and inappropriate this was. So then when it was reported in the paper the next day about, oh, this was a lovely addition to the local fair and everybody appreciated it, it was from a tourist perspective. But what I heard from a local perspective was the politician who had sponsored them got all of his posters defaced overnight. So there was always this kind of dual view of what was going on, because there's tourist culture, but then there's the ritual culture of the island, which is very different.
I was wondering who invited them. Was this a Chinese politician?
Yeah, his son was, as I remember, his son was in a soccer group, and somehow the soccer group was affiliated with the Brazilian performers, and they just thought it would be a nice change. But
Definitely a change. Maybe not so nice to some people. We have several more questions, but there are a few really good ones in the chat that are starting to, because we're getting so many great commentary back and forth that I don't want to lose at least two really great questions for the authors. One is from Claire Chow, who is a good friend of all three of ours, and she's in Honolulu right now. So we've got another location. Her question for both of you is, do you feel that in bicultural marriages, there's a tendency to truly meet halfway? Or is it that one spouse has to compromise more than the other spouse? That's a very tricky question. Who wants to go first? Heather?
yeah, I will. I think it depends on where you're living, whose turf you're on. You know, when we were lucky enough to meet in Hawaii, which is unique and a lot of mixed race people, a lot of mixed marriages. We met at the East-West Center, which is a hotbed of international intercultural romance. So we're very much in between there. But when we're in the US, I'm often the one that's kind of moderating behavior or explaining things. Fred spent a lot of time in the US, but particularly with my family. When we're here, I rely on him for a lot of cultural interpretation as well as translation. So I think it's more a matter of navigation and negotiation in a good, balanced intercultural relationship. And I know that some of the people here have lived in Hawaii and been at the East-West Center. In Hawaii, people learn how to play with ethnicity and race and to talk about it openly. So that gives you a way to negotiate culture.
What do you think, Susan? What's your experience in that tough question that Claire asked?
Well, I was a little bit younger and thought that I thought that I could adapt, and I thought I could meet him much more closer to his perspective or his culture. And he was seen at the university as being more international than a lot of the students in our international dormitory. So I think my mistake in the beginning was to be so accommodating. And a lot of the times, like, it didn't really matter. Like with the photos, the wedding photos, I was disappointed. But, in the end, we had our album and whatever. But when we had a baby and we were only, June, we were like 5 months into our new life in America, in San Francisco. suddenly everything changed because there were things now that were not negotiable. And I couldn't, I couldn't just capitulate. For instance, like eating, at that point, this was like 1998, pediatricians were really worried about allergies. And there's always like a time where it changes. Can you introduce solids at 4 months, at 6 months? Well, in China, it's like, 2 months. And my in-laws were living with us and they wanted to feed Jake noodles and tofu. And I thought, well, gosh, there could be a soy allergy, or there could be like, get choke on the noodle. And it just, I couldn't compromise with that. And then it was hard for him and his parents when I started standing up for myself. And it made it harder. So I think like my advice would be, don't give up too much of yourself in the beginning, try to find that halfway mark, because if you go beyond that, it's really hard to go back when things do matter. So.
And can you explain your title of your book and how it fits
Right.
with that
So
point exactly, right?
So The Good Chinese Wife, this actually was, I had a boss who was Malaysian Chinese. I worked at the Open University of Hong Kong. It was a distance education institute way before the pandemic. So my boss, I was meeting my ex-husband's, he was my husband at the time, his ex-wife, the first one, because I was the second, and their daughter. And I took off a half day, and my husband at the time was in China. So it was just, I was alone with the ex-wife and the daughter. And I'd heard all these awful things about the ex-wife. So I was nervous, and I told my boss, I'm gonna go take him out to lunch and we're gonna meet. And she said, "You're such a good Chinese wife." And it turns out I love the ex-wife and the daughter, and it was one of my happiest days. We had such a good time, and it was really sad when they went back to Zhuhai that day. So that was the title of the book.
But isn't it really that in trying to be a good Chinese wife, you kind of compromise yourself?
Right.
Is that sort of the theme? How would
Right.
you
And
say?
I didn't even know what is a good Chinese wife. Everyone is so different. There's no like general, there's nothing general about that. Everyone's different. It depends what region you come from. It depends your family. It's like saying an American wife, like that could be anything. So it was just me trying to learn who I was, and
Putting pressure on yourself, right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we have a great question from Big Nocturner, who is very active in the chat. I think it's wonderful. So her question is for both of you. And she said, one of you is a political scientist and one is an ethnographer. So how did you let your academic discipline impact your writing or the way you interpreted things that you saw as foreign in China? Did you self-censor yourself, or did you try to correct your instincts from being American? I mean, how did that play out for each of you? Susan, you want to start that, and then Heather?
Sure. I mean, because I studied Chinese politics, and it was from a historical standpoint. I was studying like 1906, 1908 reforms, but I was really interested in the history, like the modern history of China and the politics. So my ex-husband was born at the end of the Great Leap Forward, and he was a student during the Cultural Revolution. And I think because I was so aware of these periods in China's history or modern history, I excused a lot of it. So I thought, if he's being this way, it's probably because he left home at the age of 14 to join an opera troupe rather than going to the fields to be a worker. And it saved him from labor. But he was gone from home from the age of 14 to 21 and wasn't in school. He didn't have his parents with him. And then at 21, he went right to college. So he was older, but everyone was back then. So every time there was some issue, I attributed it to that childhood and that like specific political environments. And in the end, I mean, I think a lot of it was just a personality issue, and because there's plenty of people that grew up during those times and they had they were fine. So I don't think it was the big question in my book. Was it culture? Was it personality? The older I get, I think the more of it was personality. So But I did make a lot of excuses because of the political environment he grew up in.
So it might have made you hang on a little longer than maybe you really should have.
Definitely, yeah. Or not put my foot down earlier.
And what about you, Heather, as an ethnographer?
Well, first of all, I have my background is in folklore studies, and because I'm so fascinated with folklore, I really look at things on a very personal and social level. You know, that I'm really interested in ritual, tradition, belief systems. So whenever, I think it's protected me in a lot of ways because, or allowed me to step back in some ways, because when I'm reacting to something like a lack of privacy or feeling like, you know, my schedule's being controlled or my diet or whatever, I can step back and think about, you know, what do these things mean? You know, I don't particularly like Chinese banquet food, for example, and I've eaten a lot of it, but I know how important it is as a ritual of togetherness and family dynamics. And so my interest in that often transcends my likes and dislikes. And I'm constantly analyzing those things. And also in ethnographic training, we're really trained to listen and to ask people for their perspective, to try and enter into somebody else's perspective, as well as qualify our own. And I think one of the really important keys to a intercultural relationship is being able to respect somebody else's perspective, even when you don't agree with it. And so I think my training in that has allowed me, at least particularly in the writing of all of this, to think about these things differently and to try and understand family dynamics and cultural dynamics and why those are important. And to sort of set that aside from my own likes and dislikes, as well as analyze my own culture. I've really had to look at American culture is flawed in many ways, and my family dynamics may not, they're different. And so to look at those different systems together has been really instructive for me in terms of integrating into a Chinese family, as well as reintegrating into my American family.
So it's almost like you had an academic hat that sometimes you'd get frustrated with the personal side. And if you put the academic hat on your head or glasses, whatever.
I call it anthro brain. You have to step into anthro brain whenever I'm totally overwhelmed by the noise and the confusion and the chaos. Earplugs help too, but I can step into anthro brain and think, okay, now why is noise so important, rather than why do they have to do this?
Can't they just lower the volume a little? Don't you wish you had a little volume button?
A volume and a dimmer switch. And I'm always saying, why are the restaurants so bright? And Fred keeps saying, because it's happening, because that's the aesthetic. And
it's
so
happy. It's a happy thing, right? Yeah. It's just a different value. So I'm curious. I mean, we've got several different questions that kind of focus on this next question that I was going to ask you anyway, which is, in your view, your personal view from your experience, what do you think is the key to a good cross-cultural relationship? So some last, some don't. What would you say is the key? You want to start, Heather, and then we'll get to Susan?
I would go back to what I just said about being willing to critique yourself, I think. But I think for me, a sense of humor, humility, and a willingness to step into the other person's position. I think, in our relationship, if you listened in on a day in our house, probably most people would be appalled, because we're constantly using stereotypes. We use stereotypes a lot, like, do you want to eat Chinese food or Haole food? Haole is the word for white people in Hawaii. Do you, you do that because you're, Chinese people, of course, that's what they do. We're constantly stereotyping and making jokes about each other's culture because we've learned to laugh at ourselves and to get over ourselves enough to not react to those things. And I think that's been really key to really stepping in and trying to understand why we do the things we do, and also being able to do that with ourselves as well, so that we meet in some middle ground, and it's humbling to have to examine your own behavior as well, and not just assume that, for me, my American white perspective is correct. It's not. It's often relative. And so I think for me, those are the keys.
That is, I think the good sense of humor is at least for me in my marriage is vital. What about you, Susan? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I totally agree. The sense of humor is key. I also feel like it's really important that each person feels really strong in their own, selves, because if there's any type of insecurity, it's just too easy to take offense or to be on the defensive more than you would have to. So I think if both people come into it with just like a really strong sense of their own self, with a genuine respect of the other culture, and that's going to happen no matter, like in any marriage. I mean, you're going to be different from the person you marry, because we're all different. But it's easier to compromise if you do feel strong in your in your own person, because otherwise, I think it's too difficult to compromise or negotiate, and to see the other person as something that someone who you want to work with. So, if that makes sense.
And you learned from your first marriage and made a big success of your second marriage. So were there some of those lessons that you picked up in the first marriage, even though they're obviously very different men?
Oh yeah, definitely. So my husband now he's from Chicago, but he's Catholic. I'm Jewish. He's from the South Side. I'm from the northern suburbs. I mean, that's a big difference here. And I think because I knew what I had done wrong before, with just kind of not being who I was. I was more secure in myself, and we talked about things. I mean, it was real. It seemed just so much easier. We talked about raising kids, what religion that was going to be. That could be really, really hard for someone. In my first marriage, we didn't talk about it. He didn't have a religion, so I just assumed. But you can't make those assumptions. And so I also, my ex-husband was divorced when I met him, and he sometimes brought that into our relationship. Like, I know what it's like to get divorced, and if we're having these problems now, it's not good. And I was really sensitive about that in my new marriage of 15 years, because I never bring that up. I mean, he read my book, so he knows what happened. But it's easy, just here's the book. But I never bring it up, because that could be so threatening. If I say, well, if we can't figure out who's going to do the dishes tonight, it's going to be bad news for the future. And that's basically what the message was in my first marriage. And I know, like, I would never do that. So, I did learn, like, what not to do in the first one.
There's a lot of wisdom in both of the things that you've been saying. So I wanted to ask, I mean, we've been talking about cross-cultural marriages, but what about the challenges of writing? You've each written a memoir, writing about these cross-cultural experiences. What are some of those challenges? Heather, do you want to start this one?
Well, I think, of course, this is a difficult era to write about those things too, because there are so many flashpoints. I think what was particularly challenging for me, and Susan may have encountered this as well, is trying to write about race and ethnicity in an international context. Because, for instance, my whiteness and Fred's Chineseness are perceived very differently in the United States, in the mainland United States, than they are in Hawaii, and very differently again in Hong Kong. So how to write about those in a way that will be intelligible to people that have not traveled. There's so many people in the US and other places that have not traveled outside of their own culture. And so they're used to the rigid categories within their own culture. And I think that's been, first of all, it's been very eye-opening for me to understand that my whiteness is relative in different environments. And, and Fred, he's got sort of a Pan-Asian face. I take him to the United States and people start speaking Spanish to him, they don't know what to do with him. And in Hawaii, even people were saying, what are you? So, you know, we're just seen very differently. He was recently complimented by a waitress for having an American wife. And he was kind of disconcerted by that. And he said, oh, colonial thinking, they still think like that. And so he tried to sort of debunk that with her. And I was embarrassed. I thought, oh, great, now I'm a trophy wife. So, you know, that's very different than in Hawaii, where haole can be used as a pejorative. And I often felt like he was my entry into communities that might have been suspicious of me if I hadn't had a brown husband. So I think that was a big challenge, to try and write about those different environments relative to each other and in ways that different audiences could deal with.
And just being aware that there are different audiences that would perceive it differently. So you being more careful in how you word things.
Right, and since I've taught identity politics and multiculturalism of various kinds for a long time, I sort of had the language for that, but I still wasn't prepared for how the experience would change for me and for him in terms of, you know, being centered or decentered in a different kind of cultural space and a different demographic.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Susan? What were some of the writing challenges? Your book came out a few years ago, and now today is a little bit different. So both the writing then and also presenting the book today.
Right. And I think the problems today, you know, they just took this out of the, you know, the jargon, but in young adult literature, there's this hashtag own voices. And so the whole thing was, you know, we need to give voice to people who are not represented in literature. And I was writing about this marriage to someone who was not like me and was from a country that traditionally didn't have a big voice in English literature. So I was very concerned about how my ex-husband would appear, and I did not want to generalize. I wasn't saying all Chinese men were like this, or all Hubei men, or all Wuhan. Like he was one person, and I tried to make the other men, you know, Chinese men in the book, seem more like not seem like him, because I didn't want people to think I was generalizing. And I think it's hard because that is a natural instinct for readers to think. But if I were writing about a white husband, no one would say, "Oh, white men are all like that." I mean, maybe for some things, but I think that it's hard, because when you do write about a culture that hasn't been represented for a long time in English literature, I don't want like audiences or readers to get the wrong idea of what I'm trying to present. So it was hard, and I don't know if I did it well, but you know.
At least you were aware of it as you were writing, even then, just be aware of it, and also when you speak about it as well, right?
Yeah,
exactly. So we have only 2 minutes left. We've got a lot of great comments actually in the chat. So not so much in the way of questions, but just really briefly, if you could each tell us how your book has been received and if there's anything that surprised you. Maybe Susan first, and then we'll let Heather have the last word.
Oh, sorry, I was reading the chat. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to know how your book has been received, and if there were any surprises, or happy or not so happy.
Yeah, so it was received really well. I mean, better than I thought. And the happy surprise I had was, I mentioned this before, that I had met my ex-husband's 8-year-old daughter that one time I took them out to lunch. And she's 31 now, and she read my book and contacted me a few years ago, probably about 2018. And we had these great email exchanges. And she said, I answered every question she had about her dad's life in America when he lived here. So that was just really special. And I was, you know, it's like, it made like the whole book worth it just for that. So I was, you know, I was really happy about that.
That's a really wonderful outcome. How about you, Heather? Yours has only been out about a month, but what's
mine just came out May 11th. So I'm still, I'm getting some lovely notes from people and getting responses back, and the reviews are slowly coming in now. But one of the surprises, I think, was that I have a number of American-born Chinese friends who had wonderful things to say, because they, being maybe a couple of generations removed from some of the traditions that I was witnessing in Hong Kong and on Changzhou, they were really appreciative of my attention to the the practices, the foods, those kinds of things. They were recognizing things, or they were finding explanations for things that they only partially do or remembered doing in the past. So that was really nice to have that come back, because I also felt like, because these traditions are changing even within Fred's family, this was an opportunity for me to record those traditions for them as well. And so I felt gratified that people appreciated that.
Wow, they're both really good surprises. I want to share screen and put up everybody the 3 books that that we've been talking about. So Rabbit in the Moon, Good Chinese Wife, and my book, When the Red Gates Opened, which we didn't really talk about, but I'd love to hear your responses. And I just wanted to say that we have, you can see on this slide, our websites. And we all have contact forms on our websites, and would really love to hear from you. And don't forget to buy our books if you're interested. You can, as we say, you can get them at your local bookstore or online. One thing that Heather particularly wanted me to mention is that if you read it and you really enjoy it, you may not want to do this, but if you could bring yourself to do it, to go on Amazon and rate it. You just could initially just put a number of stars. We love 5-star ratings. That's the highest, but whatever you think it's worth. And then if you can, leave a review. And a review doesn't have to be anything fancy, maybe even just a couple of words like, oh, I really loved this book because XYZ. It doesn't have to be a really sophisticated review. If you feel like it, that would really make us happy. So we are really, all 3 of us, just really hoping that you will contact us on our websites, because I tell you, as a writer, I have to say the very best thing about being an author is hearing from readers. So please don't hesitate. So thanks so much for coming. I think this has been a great talk, and I can tell from the chat that people are really excited about it too. So we'll end it there and stop the share and just say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dori.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dori, so much.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.